Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar to tell you about the Institutional Challenge Grant Program at the William T. Grant Foundation and about how to apply. I'm Jenny Irons. I'm a Senior Program Officer at the Foundation. I'm joined today by Adam Gamoran, our President, and Adam will be helping me throughout the presentation to address questions as they arise. We are going to have two question and answer periods, which I will signal along the way. But I do want to let you know that you can submit questions at any time through the question and answer section on this webinar, and Adam is going to be filtering through those, and we'll be pausing to answer some of those. I have incorporated responses to some of the questions that were submitted when you registered for the webinar, so I'll be trying to address some of those things along the way. I do also want to mention that we are recording this webinar, and it will be made available on our website in the coming few days. And let's get started. So I want to tell you a little bit about the Institutional Challenge Grant first, what the theory of change is, why we created it. I'll talk through the 4 goals of the Institutional Challenge Grant. We'll pause for some questions there about the material I cover initially, and then we'll turn to thinking really about the application process. So let me tell you a little bit about the William T. Grant Foundation. The William T. Grant Foundation was founded in 1936 by William T. Grant, who was the owner of a chain of 5 and dime stores. At the foundation, we have 2 primary focus areas. One, we are interested in funding research that examines ways to reduce inequality among young people ages 5 to 25 in the United States. Because we are a research funder, we are also interested in the question of how to make research more useful to people who need it. So we also fund research on improving the use of research evidence, which is really trying to unpack the conditions under which to make research more useful and more likely to be used. These have been our focus areas for a number of years. One of the registrants asked if we have any intentions to plan to change our grant programs or focus areas given the shifts we've seen in the national climate over the past few months, and our answer is no. Our president, Adam Gamoran, has recently written a very short blog post about the importance of remaining steadfast in our mission during these times, so these will continue to be our focus areas. The focus areas were our impetus for creating the Institutional Challenge Grant Program. We have learned a lot about the use of research evidence over the past few years, past several years actually, and so the Institutional Challenge Grant really merges our interests both in reducing inequality in youth outcomes and improving the use of research evidence in policy and practice across youth-serving systems to improve outcomes for young people. So one thing I want to underscore is that we are a funder. We are interested in funding good work that tackles ways to address challenges related to inequality across all youth-serving systems. So that includes education, child welfare, the juvenile justice system, mental health, really any system that affects young people's lives. And again, the focus is on young people in the United States ages 5 to 25. So yes, someone asked, do you fund work on higher education? Indeed, we do that. And for folks, for example, who are in their young adult years in the juvenile justice system, those are our parameters, 5 to 25, but it's across all youth-serving systems. Now, from our portfolio on the use of research evidence, we have learned that research is more likely to be used to improve youth outcomes and to address problems of policy and practice when it is responsive to questions that policymakers and practitioners have. It's responsive to questions they want answered, and they may not necessarily be the questions that researchers want to address or that they want to write about for peer-reviewed publications. They are responsive to actual urgent needs that people need addressed when they're working on the ground to serve young people. Research is also more likely to be used when it's routinized, or other words, when the use of research evidence is built into the routines and practices of an organization. Research is more likely to be used when it is relational, when it is developed, co-created in the context of trusting relationships. The picture I just put up here is a picture of one of our ICG partnerships between the Policy Lab at Georgia State University and Achieve Atlanta higher education nonprofit in Atlanta, Georgia. So these are the things that we know about the use of research evidence, and one very good way to improve the likelihood that research is more likely to be used is when it's conducted in research practice partnerships. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But for those of you who are joining us today who work in research practice partnerships, Know that the time it takes to cultivate research practice partnerships, and oftentimes some of even the products that are produced from research practice partnerships, aren't always valued in higher education. So the other thing the Institutional Challenge Grant does is acknowledge that academia itself, excuse me, often has its own barriers to conducting, to supporting, to rewarding the kind of partnership work that makes research more likely to be used. So as we'll unpack in a few minutes, the goal of the Institutional Challenge Grant, or one of the big goals of the Institutional Challenge Grant, is to have universities acknowledge and address some of the barriers to incentivizing and then supporting engaged research. So let me go through each of the four main goals of the Institutional Challenge Grant and unpack them for you to help you understand what our selection committee members are looking for when they evaluate applications to this program. The Institutional Challenge Grant asks universities, and yes, these are partnerships between universities and nonprofit organizations or public agency, to grow an existing partnership in which research is co-created, it's mutually beneficial, and its goal is improving outcomes for the young people served by the nonprofit organization or public agency. Together, the university and the nonprofit or public agency co-create a research agenda to be carried out over the course of the grant to address inequalities in youth outcomes. And at the William T. Grant Foundation, we're especially interested in research that addresses inequalities on the basis of race, ethnicity, economic standing, immigrant origin, language minority status, or sexual and gender minority youth. So together, these partners work together to build the capacity of the nonprofit agency or public agency to use research evidence, both over the period of the grant and in the long term. And they also work to enhance the capacity of university researchers to be better partners. And again, the final big goal of the grant really is to create institutional change at universities to better support and incentivize partnership research. So let's dig in a little bit more to some of these goals. So first, let's talk about research practice partnerships. If you look on our website, if you go to the search bar there and you search for RPP microsite, you will find that as a foundation, we offer resources to universities and nonprofit organizations working in partnership. And the way we define a research partnership, as you can see here, is that they are long-term. They are built for the long term, and that's why we fund partnerships between universities and nonprofit organizations or public agencies, because our hope is this will be a lasting, sustainable partnership that will remain there even if staff turn over. So research practice partnerships are long-term. They're mutually beneficial collaborations in which questions are co-created, research agendas are co-created, partners are responsive to one another and work to try to equitably address urgent issues. Adam, I want to pause here and have you join us to talk a little bit about whether or not there's an ideal time for a partnership to apply for one of these institutional challenge grants.
Thanks, Jenny. That's a question that comes up a lot. There's no specific time frame when grantees are eligible or ineligible, but we advise that applicants have enough experience within the partnership to be able to convince the selection committee that there really is a working partnership there. So usually it doesn't work out to create the partnership just for this competition, but rather to use this competition to build on a partnership that is already nascent, at least. Sometimes researchers have long-standing relationships with persons in government or nonprofit organizations, and they can formalize and institutionalize that partnership with the grant. So that's the kind of relationship that often leads to success in this competition. At the same time, if the partnership is so well established and so well funded, something that's been in operation for decades and has a large and sustained budget, then the selection committee might ask, what is the value added of being awarded a grant in this competition? So somewhere between already formed, but not so well institutionalized that our funds don't seem to add a lot, that's the sweet spot for this application.
Great. Thanks so much, Adam. So let's turn now to the question of what does it mean to develop a joint research agenda, and how do you apply for that when, again, the research is being conducted in a partnership, and it may be challenging to know beforehand exactly what everything will look like. Well, let me return briefly to thinking about our focus area and what it means to study ways to reduce inequality. Well, one of the things I want to underscore is we fund a lot of different types of research. When we're talking about funding studies that examine ways to reduce inequality, we might fund studies that are building interventions, programmatic interventions to address inequality. We may be funding studies that are examining ways through which programs work, so the mechanisms through which programs work to reduce inequalities. Some of our grantees are using causal methods to evaluate program interventions or policy interventions to reduce inequality. And often they are focused on outcomes, including reducing inequality in academic outcomes. So for example, I earlier showed you a picture of our partnership between Georgia State University and Achieve Atlanta. Achieve Atlanta is an organization that works to improve access to higher education among young people going to public schools in the Atlantic area. So Georgia Policy Labs are working with them to causally evaluate their scholarship program. Does it make a difference for post-secondary outcomes? They have already found that yes, in fact, it does. They have used research evidence to actually expand access to that program. And now they're turning to questions of more long-term impact. So for example, if you give young people a scholarship to attend college, what does their debt look like in the long run? Are we helping to alleviate economic burdens as well? So there are different ways you can think about tackling outcomes, behavioral outcomes, economic outcomes, social outcomes. We are really open to a range of different kinds of methodological approaches and questions. We just want you to see you all centering responses to inequality rather than trying to understand inequality, for example. Although I will say that sometimes our partnerships have to begin maybe with a first step. If you're working with the State Department of Education and they lack data about inequality, you may need to initially dig in to what things look like to then begin to address that inequality. And again, this second point is just highlighting the dimensions of inequality that we prioritize at the foundation. I just want to again say that we do fund work across a range of youth serving systems. It's not solely education, but we are interested in efforts to reduce inequality across youth serving systems. And you'll see that here in 3 different partnerships I want to highlight to you as examples of research that they are undertaking. One of our partnerships is between Johns Hopkins University and the Fort Belknap Indian community. And in this partnership, they are using mixed methods approaches to develop a culturally responsive intervention for preventing suicide among Indigenous adolescents and young adults. One thing you will note is that Johns Hopkins University is located in Maryland and the Fort Belknap Indian community is not. While most of our partnerships are co-located in the same state or even small community, sometimes they are not. But in the application, they offer a strong rationale for why that is the case and how they will be able to carry out their research agenda, even though they are not co-located. The second example you see here from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the United Way of Santa Cruz County is very much a qualitative study, although it does have some quantitative elements. But they are centering youth participatory action research with middle and high school young people from the communities surrounding the University of California in Santa Cruz and the greater Santa Cruz County to identify and address barriers to the community's hopes and dreams. So they've worked, the young people, for example, have elevated the need to focus on mental health, to focus on immigrant safety, and they're bringing in the voices of first-generation Latinx college students at UC Santa Cruz to help with this process. And then finally, one of our newer grantees is at the University of Virginia. It's a partnership with Albemarle County Public Schools to use a quasi-experimental mixed methods design to examine how a cohort program improves college and career readiness for young people who are from the areas around the University of Virginia who historically have not had the best access to post-secondary education. So I'm going to turn back to Adam because, as I alluded to, it can be complicated to propose a research agenda when you're working in partnership. But Adam, having served for years on our selection committee, can give you some insight into what our selection committee members are looking for when they're evaluating research agendas in these applications.
Thanks, Jenny. presenting the research agenda in the application is one of the trickiest parts of the application, because on the one hand, the research needs to be grounded in the partnership, and you need time to develop with your partners what the agenda is going to be and what the plan for pursuing the research is. There's even a planning period of up to 6 months that's allowed in the application. On the other hand, the selection committee needs to be able to judge whether you are proposing research that will help the community partner reduce inequality and youth outcomes. And that means you have to give sufficient detail in the research for the selection committee to make that judgment. So what are the research questions? What will be the design of the study? What measures will be used? What sample will be examined? These are standard questions about research that any selection committee would need to be able to judge the quality, rigor, and importance of the research. One approach that some applicants take is to say, we haven't made final decisions on our research because that will be decided during the planning period, but here are the kinds of questions we may pursue, or here are the questions that we have proposed to the community partner that we will pursue, or here's what the community partner has proposed to the university, and we're working out the specifics of it during the planning period. But at this point, we are anticipating a design of the following terms. And so provide us information on what the design will be, what the sample will be, what the measures will be, what outcomes you'll use to identify reducing inequality, because that's essential for the selection committee to judge the quality, rigor, and importance of the research.
Thanks, Adam. I just want to clarify one thing. I think you said the planning period can be up to 6 months, but it's up to 9 months. For the initial planning period, where you might be hammering out some details between the partnership. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, which is especially important in thinking about the research agenda, is that we do have annotated excerpts of successful proposals online, where you can see examples of proposed research agendas, including one that is more using more participatory methods. So we share that to highlight the kinds of things that you need to be able to explain in your applications. So let's move now to thinking about institutional change. To some, this may feel like the greatest challenge for this grant, and certainly it is. It is why it is called the Institutional Challenge Grant. But the key thing you want to do here is identify barriers within your institution, whether you're talking about within your division or your entire institution, to partnership research. Now, there may be a lot of barriers. We do not expect you to take them all on, but we do expect you to be thoughtful about your rationale for which barriers you are taking on. So what we want to see is that research institutions are examining and designing or redesigning institutional policies and practices to encourage sustained institutional partnerships with public agencies or nonprofit organizations. And I keep using that word sustained partnerships because it isn't just a partnership for one project, but it is a sustained ongoing partnership where you are collaborative and responsive to each other's needs. We also want to see revisions to policies and practices in ways that incentivize exceptional researchers to initiate and pursue rigorous and relevant research agendas. And we want to see shifts that improve the partnership skills of researchers. These things are all quite important things that the selection committee members look for when they're evaluating institutional change plans. And I just want to underscore, these are institutional change plans at the universities. I'll get to kind of what's going on at the partner agencies next when we talk about capacity. I want to highlight for you a few examples of institutional change that our grantees have pursued over the years and are currently pursuing. One example is the Forward Society Lab. The Forward Society Lab has been created by Gustavo Babones, an economist at the University of Toronto, whose partnership is with the Puerto Rico Department of Education. So again, that's another example where Gustavo is in Toronto, his partners are in Puerto Rico, but they have worked very closely to engage in research to improve the outcomes for young people in Puerto Rico. I'll just note, for example, when they applied going back to the research agenda, when they submitted their proposal, they had 2 questions that they knew they were going to answer. They had 2 very clearly detailed examples of their research design, and over the course of their partnership have now undertaken 5, and I think they're on their 6th different study that is really being conducted to shape policies and programmatic work at the State Department of Education in Puerto Rico. But one of the things Gustavo did with his grant is develop the Forward Society Lab, and it is now a hub for economists to do the kinds of, economists and other social scientists, but it's in the economics division at the University of Toronto to engage in rigorous research to answer important questions that community members have around the globe. So they have expanded their work quite broadly and continue to work with the State Department of Education in Puerto Rico. What you see highlighted here is one of the examples of our grantees taking on tenure and promotion policies. Not all of our grantees are doing this, but they have been quite successful at UC Berkeley with an effort led by Emily Ozer, who's in the School of Public Health there, to shift tenure and promotion criteria to better support and recognize engaged research. We have another grantee, I've already mentioned them, at UC California, at UC Santa Cruz. They now, across the UC system, have a network of folks working on tenure promotion criteria and engaged scholarship. Of course, it's no easy task to change tenure and promotion criteria. It's one thing maybe to get those criteria on the books. It's another thing to educate external reviewers, to work at the departmental level. So we have grantees who are engaging in depth with those challenges. And then this final thing I just want to mention is that some of our partnerships have created small grant competitions to support faculty at different levels in conducting partnership research. The team at Georgia State University has created a small grant program on their campus, and one of the first grants they gave out was to support faculty, not in the policy lab, but in another division, to work with the Gullah Geechee folks in Georgia to build up a museum and to recognize the heritage of the Gullah. And since that work was undertaken with a small grant, they recently got a $500,000 grant from Mellon. So that's a case where they started out with a small grant from the small grants program created by one of our grantees and now have gone out to leverage that to get greater grant dollars. So Adam, I wonder if you could say a little bit about what makes a compelling strategy for institutional change? Because people could propose things to do, but they may not necessarily be seen as compelling by the selection commission.
Thanks, Jenny. My fingers have just been flying as I've been answering some of the questions that have been coming in online. So you've already given a number of good examples, but you know, the first thing that someone asks about when they think about barriers to community engaged scholarship in universities is the reward system for faculty. Mm-hmm. And the first thing we think about when it comes to faculty reward system is tenure and promotion. And indeed, many of the institutional challenge grant winners are working with their universities to find ways to value, appreciate, and evaluate community engaged scholarship or partnership oriented engaged scholarship within the career development, within the career advancement system. And we've even had cases at UC Berkeley and UC Santa Cruz, for example, that have developed specific frameworks for evaluating community engaged scholarship as part of the tenure and promotion system. And that's very exciting because unless faculty can be rewarded for this kind of work, they will hesitate to engage in it. But tenure and promotion is not the only thing that we're talking about. It's not the only way of valuing and encouraging and incentivizing partnership-oriented scholarship within the university. It's not the only way to encourage faculty to pursue research that solves real problem for real people in their communities and regions. There are other ways. First of all, the tenure point is not the only career advancement. We can recognize community engaged scholarship at later points in the career advancement system. Second, we can create positions within the university dedicated to outreach and partnership, such as associate dean positions. Many of our grantees have created associate dean for outreach and partnership type promotions. Third, universities have put resources into encouraging community engaged scholarships, such as summer salaries or teaching releases, because this kind of work takes time to develop. Fourth, we've had university centers created, such as the examples that Jenny has just given, which provide incentives, resources, expertise, mediation with external partners, all sorts of opportunities to encourage community-engaged research. Some universities, as another example, some universities award prizes and elevate the visibility of scholarship that has public impact within their communities. So these are some examples, and we've got more on the website. And I encourage you to think creatively and come up with examples that we haven't even seen before. Certainly, tenure and promotion, career advancement generally is an important area, but it's not the only area that signals valuing scholarship that solves problems for people and communities.
Thanks so much, Adam. So, and I just want to highlight that, as I do when I give presentations about this work, that one of the exciting things we've seen happening over the past few years across the United States and really globally is more attention and leadership around supporting engaged research at the university level. There are 2 QR codes here that link to different resources that might be helpful to you in thinking about institutional change. I think we've also put links in the chat. But the first link takes you to a landing page on our site that highlights a scan conducted by Emily Ozer and some other folks to really think about shifts in support for engaged research across the university system. I think there should also be a link in your chat to a report by the APLU on modernizing scholarship for the public good, which is also quite useful. And then finally, the National Academies last year hosted a workshop on engaged research and thinking about ways to build institutional capacity. That report has just been released. We were one of the co-funders for that effort. So I hope you'll find these resources useful in thinking about proposing your own strategies for institutional change. So let me turn now to the 4th goal of the grant, which is enhancing the capacities of both partners to collaborate in producing and using research. Again, I noted that one of the major barriers to using research is that the capacity can be quite limited in public agencies and nonprofit organizations to use research. I'll also say that a number of our funded partnerships, especially in the case where universities are partnering with school districts, for example, there often is research capacity, but they are stretched quite thin. And so the ICG grant often enables those partnerships to expand their capacity to work together and perhaps integrate the use of research evidence in different ways into their organizational routines. So what you want to think about within your partnership, and Adam already underscored this when he answered the question about what's the right stage to apply, is what will this grant add to your ability to work together as partners, both to expand the capacity of the partner organization to use research and to expand the capacity of university researchers to be better partners. So I'm going to actually talk mostly about what it means to expand capacity at nonprofit agencies or public organizations or public agencies. I've mentioned a couple of times the partnership between Georgia State University and Achieve Atlanta. So and this is fresh on my mind because I just participated in a panel with that team at the American Educational Research Association. And those organizations initially came together when one of the faculty members at Georgia Policy Labs, as he was moving to work at Georgia State, was connected with Achieve Atlanta because someone he knew said, hey, you should really reach out to Achieve Atlanta. I think you'd be interested in their work. They'd be interested in you. And so the first thing he did was conduct an evaluation for them. Well, when the Institutional Challenge Grant opportunity surfaced, it gave them a way to begin to think about how to expand their capacity to work together, how to build that long-term sustained research practice partnerships. And now the faculty member, Jonathan Smith, spends 1 day a week in the offices of Achieve Atlanta, where he's very integrated into the work they're doing. He can help them think about how to tackle problems their internal research team is thinking about. And they're really finding that a useful way to build collaboration across the university and the Achieve Atlanta organization. Other folks have similarly embedded staff within community partner organizations to try to shift routines and improve the use of research evidence. Sometimes university partners host trainings to build the capacity of staff to understand and use research evidence. So again, there are a lot of different ways you can go about this. But really what you want to think about is, what is the rationale for the steps you're pursuing, and how do they make sense for the work that you're conducting together? I want to talk a little bit now, before we pause briefly for some question and answers, about the mid-career fellow role. So when this project, when this grant program was envisioned, the idea, and it often works this way, but not always, is that the principal investigator is someone who's in a position of institutional leadership to really be able to drive the institutional change, which, and ask any PI of our grants, does take time and learning coordination and navigating across different divisions and departments and faculty. But the mid-career fellow these are really the folks who are carrying out the research. These are folks who are within 8 to 20 years of receiving their doctoral degree or other terminal degree in their field. And these are the folks who are really developing their capacity to be effective partners to policymakers and practitioners. The proposal should include, as is noted here, a feasible plan for using the fellows to increase the capacity to use research evidence and to conduct the research. Because I will tell you, the mid-career fellows, they need to be folks with the skills to carry out a fairly significant research project. Because remember, the initial grant period, and we'll get into this more in a minute, is 3 years. The continuation period is 2 years. So there's a lot of work being conducted over the course of 5 years. And you want to have, strong folks in place to do that work. So let me control my situation here and move on to some more details about mid-career fellows. So if you're looking at the application guidance, you know that there are a number of requirements for the mid-career fellows. They need to be 8 to 20 years out. We have requirements about funding for the fellowship. So the grant itself can provide funding for 2 years of a full-time equivalent fellow, and universities are asked to fund 1 additional year of a full-time equivalent fellow. This is another case where there are different ways the partnership can think about divvying up funds and allocations of mid-career fellows. So if you're looking at the application guidance, we offer this illustration to demonstrate different configurations that perhaps you have mid-career fellows at the university, you have them at the nonprofit organization, maybe you have the same fellows over all 3 years, or you mix them up over the years, depending on what things you're trying to accomplish with the project. And so before we turn to our first Q&A, I want to pause again and ask Adam to say a little bit more about what the selection committee looks for when they're thinking about what mid-career fellows are doing.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. We're seeking mid-career fellows because we want to identify persons to pursue the research in partnership who have some experience, who are not just out of their PhDs, but have established themselves as successful researchers. And at the same time, we don't want people who are viewing this as a retirement job to do at the end of their career. On the contrary, we'd like people to get involved in partnership-oriented engaged scholarship who have some runway to pursue this for a long career afterwards. So that's the reason for the focus on the mid-career fellow. There are many ways of structuring this, as you were already explaining. Many universities, or many applicants, I should say, do this by having one of the mid-career fellows paid for by the grant working at the community partner at a 50% level for each of 2 years. So that's 1 FTE. A second fellow working at the university paid for by the grant, working 50% for each of 2 years. Again, that's another FTE. And then a third fellow paid for by the university, also working at the university, 50%, for 2 years. That's the third FTE paid for by the university. So that is a common way of doing it, but you can break it up in many different ways. We do ask that a mid-career fellow who is spending time work at least half time for at least half the year with the community partner, because otherwise there's just not a sufficient investment of time and energy to be a meaningful commitment. So, don't try to break it up into quarters or tenths or something like that. We're really trying to build relationships between the individuals who are serving these different organizations. And that does take some commitment of time.
Yeah, thank you so much. So let's stop now for a break, pause for a break on questions about material we've covered thus far. Just a reminder, after this brief Q&A session, we're going to dive into the application process. So we'll say more about the application and review in the next part of the webinar. So I really want to take any clarifying questions about the material covered thus far, which is, again, focused on the 4 major goals of the grant. One of the questions we got in advance was about the expectations regarding the balance between research activities and direct programmatic support. For the most part, your funds should be used to cover research activities or capacity building activities. Very little of this funding is going to direct programmatic support. That tends to come from other sources. But you do want to be sure you're allocating enough funding to carry out the research so that you have a fully staffed research team. But you also want to think about allotting funding for capacity building activities, and then to the extent that it makes sense, divided up in ways, again, that make sense for the project across the university and community partners. I will say, Adam earlier mentioned the planning period of up to 9 months. That's you can use up to $60,000 for that planning period. And the funds should be divided up equally between the university and community partner during that planning period. Adam, have you had other questions come through that we might address?
We have had many questions. My fingers have been
Right.
flying trying to answer as many as possible, but there are a few I think that would be great if you would address,
Okay.
Jenny. So one person is asking about, what if you have multiple community partners? Can you have a partnership that involves multiple community partners?
The short answer is yes, you can. We have a number of current grantees who have multiple community partners. So for example, our partnership at UT Austin is working with 3 local community-based organizations, as well as the district attorney's office in Austin, to try to prevent young people from engagement with the juvenile justice system. So you can work across multiple partners. Like, one thing you want to keep in mind is the more partners who are part of the work, the more complicated things get. But certainly we have had a team successfully propose partnership work that include multiple partners, including our folks at Washington University St. Louis, who are working with 3 different community partner organizations. Santa Clara is working with 2 different organizations. One thing to keep in mind is you will have to have one lead community partner. So as we talk about the application process, we'll talk about the fact that if you make it to the finalist stage, the PI from the university side and the PI from the community side come in together. So there does need to be one lead from one of your partner organizations.
Thanks, Jenny. And can you talk about the role of the mid-career fellow versus the role of the PI? May a mid-career fellow be the PI? Is it better to have an administrative leader as the PI? How should we be thinking about this?
This is a good question, and I will tell you that when the program was initially envisioned, the idea was the PI would be someone in a position of institutional leadership who could drive the institutional change. The mid-career fellow would be leading the research. In practice, sometimes that is what happens, but there are cases where we funded teams where the mid-career fellow is also the PI. As we say in the application guidance, there needs to be a clear rationale for that. And you need to be very clear about how you're going to be able to both carry out the institutional change, or perhaps have other partners at the university who are involved with the grant and helping you work on the institutional change, alongside balancing leading the research agenda. So again, there are different ways to configure the leadership of the grant and who's in the mid-career fellow role, but the committee will want to see a strong rationale for why what you're proposing makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And should the PI be someone with a PhD, someone who has research experience?
Yes, the PI should be someone with a PhD or the whatever the terminal degree might be in your field and has research experience. I mean, even in the cases where the PI might be less involved with the day-to-day research activities, but perhaps as in a position of leadership as dean or provost, so they just don't have the time to be engaged with research. These are all folks with PhDs who have significant research experience. And keep in mind too that whoever the PI is from the university side is the person who comes in and represents the partnership in a finalist interview, and they need to be able to talk about the research agenda in detail as well.
Thanks, Jenny. And for clarification and responding to another question, the mid-career fellow from the partner agency doesn't necessarily have a PhD, right? Could you talk about the qualifications for a mid-career fellow from the partner agency?
That's correct. Yeah, I mean, the expectation is, usually the mid-career fellow at a practice or partner agency is also roughly 8 to 20 years out of joining that particular field. So they do not always have a PhD. In fact, I would say that many of them do not, but they have significant experience either working with that organization or a similar organization. So they're poised to be the key person within the nonprofit organization or public agency to really help drive efforts to improve the capacity to use research evidence. And I will say sometimes, mid-career fellows in the nonprofit organization or public agencies get promoted or they change positions, and sometimes they stay with the work or they find different ways to navigate organizational change so the work continues.
Thanks. And here's a question that I think is for me because it responds to something I commented earlier about the maturity of the partnership. How mature should the partnership be? Look, you're trying to convince a selection committee that you will be able to establish this partnership, that the partnership will be productive and will work together to solve problems that the community partner needs solved through research. And so you don't want it to be so nascent that it will be hard to convince the selection committee that this is really well enough established to do the work that you propose. At the same time, you don't want it to be so mature that the selection committee will ask, why should we add additional funding? This organization is already extremely well funded. So that's the best I can say. Beyond that, you're trying to convince the committee that this is a partnership that will benefit from the funding in this program. Jenny, there's another question about whether the grant goes to the community partner or to the university, or what the flexibility or possibilities are there.
Great, thanks, Adam. No, the grant does go to the university partner, and that is because the university is asked to make a financial commitment themselves. Remember, to the grant to do the FT match for the mid-career fellow. They are often also most well positioned to administer the grant. And then finally, of course, there has to be a commitment to institutional change. So one of the elements of the application process is a letter of commitment from the university leadership that they understand what's being proposed and they are supportive of what's being proposed for institutional change.
Thanks. And here's a question that I'll take.
Okay.
One listener asks whether the participants in the project may not be youth, but connected to youth. So I'm imagining that this might be a question about research that concerns service providers, whether it's teachers or counselors or mental health workers. So the answer is the focus of the research must be reducing inequality in youth outcomes. Now, sometimes there's a well-established connection between changes in the activities of a service provider and the outcomes of the youth. And in that case, you can make the case that the research can focus on the service providers, because we know that if the research is successful, that it will help to reduce inequality in youth outcomes. So most of the applications we receive, or most of the applications that succeed, do have measures of youth outcomes. But if you can make a strong enough case based on existing literature that the impact on the more proximate outcomes, or the more proximate actors, will ultimately result in reducing inequality in youth outcomes, then that is plausible. Jenny, there are more questions, but I know you have more to present, so I think we should probably hold it there.
Yeah, let's go on to the application process now. I just do want to say that, I mean, for the most part, everything we're sharing with you today is available in one form or another on our website, so I encourage you to look there. The application guidance has a lot of detail in it, and again, we have the annotated excerpts of some proposals, so that should be helpful for you as well. Just want to quickly review these parameters. The initial grant is $650,000 for 3 years with a possible 2-year renewal. The initial $650,000 is a competitive selection process. Of course, the 2-year renewal is something we budget for, and we like to see that you're making progress towards your stated goals. So ultimately, with a 2-year renewal of $350,000, this grant is typically a grant of $1 million over 5 years. We as a foundation budget to fund one of these per year. We've been incredibly fortunate fortunate since the second year of our grant making in this program to have additional funders join us. Currently, we're very excited to be partnered with the Spencer Foundation, the Bezos Family Foundation, and the Doris Duke Foundation. Hopefully in the coming couple of weeks, you'll learn about our 4 new grantees this year. So all this to say, this year, our board approved funding for 4 new institutional challenge grants. So since the grant program was founded, instead of funding only the 8 awards we would have been able to fund as a single foundation, our funding partners have enabled us to fund 24 partnerships across universities. So we're incredibly excited about that. In the institutional challenge grant, you will want to explain how your partnership is taking on the 4 goals of the grant. Please note the indirect cost allowance is still only up to 15% of the total direct cost. I just want to skip ahead so we may have time for Q&A. Adam and I have been referring to the selection committee. This is the only grant program our research grants programs where applications do not go out for external review at some point. Our applications are reviewed by members of our selection committee. I'm going to show you a picture of their smiling, warm, welcoming faces in just a second. You can find a list of our committee members on our website. The next deadline for applications is September 15th. So for our major grants, we have a 5-page initial application stage. There is no initial application stage like that for the institutional challenge grant. It begins, and the only point of entry is the full proposal. It is quite an extensive application. We encourage folks to begin well in advance because you want to solidify letters of supports, partnership agreements, etc. I do want to highlight something that I think maybe people often miss in the application guidance, and that is one element of the application is a 4-page structured abstract. We tell you what we want you to put in there. It really is about covering the 4 goals of the grant in brief. And the reason why that's so important is that the initial stage of discussion, so the applications come in September. We do an internal staff review to screen for eligibility and strength of fit, and then applications go out to our members of our selection committee. They each review 2 or 3 applications. They come together in early December to decide who our finalists are. And at that stage in early December, because there are a lot of applications with a lot of materials, all the committee members are only reading that 4-page, well, in addition to some other stuff. They're not reading the full proposal, they're reading that 4-page structured abstract. So it is really critical that you condense all the important things in your longer narrative into that 4-page structured abstract because it is quite important for the entire selection committee. They come together, our selection committee members meet in person in early December to decide who our finalists will be. We could bring in anywhere from 4 to 7 pairs, depending on how many grants we expect to fund for a given year. And then finalists are asked to respond in writing to their reviews by selection committee members, and then also to come for in-person interviews that usually take place in late January or early February. Members of our selection committee are representatives of our funding partners. They are folks who have many years of experience working in policy or practice positions. So for example, in that front row, you'll see Ritu Kanu, who I just saw at the AERA meeting. She has long been the director of research at San Francisco Unified School District. We also have folks on our committee who are faculty members who have an extensive experience doing partnership work themselves, and people who are also in positions of institutional leadership. So they really grasp what it takes to achieve institutional change. We hope at the end of 5 years, grantees will have established strategies to facilitate sustain research practice partnerships, that the public agency or nonprofit will have increased its capacity to use research evidence, that researchers will have improved their partnership skills, and that the research generated has been used in decision-making to improve youth outcomes. And we've seen really tremendous examples of this among our current grantees that are quite wonderful. What I want to flag for you here is that we have so many resources on our website for potential applicants. Of course, the application guidance, which is linked to via QR code here, is the most critical thing for you to engage with. We have past webinars on our website, annotated proposals, blog posts written by our current grantees that explain how they have carried out the work they have carried out, and we hope that all of those things can be helpful resources to you as you prepare your applications. So wow, I really rushed through the material in the second half of this about the application process, but I do want to leave this last 9 to 10 minutes to take the questions that are coming in.
All right, we have more questions that are coming in.
Great.
Jenny, one listener, and I think more than one may have this question in mind, is asking about budget templates. How will they, where
Oh.
will they find a budget template? How will they know how to fill out the budget?
Thank you. Great question. So when you go into our grants management system, which is Smart Simple, to create your application, to build your application, you'll find a budget tab where there will be an embedded, it's like an Excel chart, an embedded chart for you to fill in the numbers, the highlights of different categories. But there's also a budget justification narrative, which is an incredibly important document. You can pull that up in Word format and see what you need to fill in, but that's where you're really laying out who the different folks are working on the grant, what their roles are going to be, different categories for spending, et cetera, et cetera. So that I would start with that with your grants management office, and then from there, once all those details are finalized, then you fill in the budget numbers.
Thanks, Jenny. And
Mhm.
here's one that I'll take. One person is asking about how the university pays for its required match. How does it pay for the required contribution of one FTE of a mid-career fellow? And the answer is any funds that the university has access to can be used for that. So if you have a grant that you can donate or a gift that you can use to support that position, or you want to just make it a course release, or any source of funding that the university has access to. It doesn't have to be from the university's instructional budget or from some specific category of the university. It just has to be a contribution above and beyond the funds obtained from this grant. And Jenny, here's a question for you. Can the partner be a community college?
Yes, the partner can be a community college. And Adam, because I've heard you talk about this, I'm going to turn it back to you to answer that question.
Sure. So, there are a lot of important research questions about reducing inequality in youth outcomes where community colleges can be part of the answer. We cover young people ages 5 to 25, so that certainly covers a significant portion of the community college population. The research leadership does need to come from the university because the whole point of the Institutional Challenge Grant is to reorient universities to support community engaged scholarship, partnership oriented engaged scholarship. And so that does have to be based in the universities. Let's see, Jenny, what kind of guidance can we give about co-principal investigators? I know that the PI is the university leader and the co-PI is the leader from the nonprofit or government organization. But can there be other co-PIs on these grants?
Yes, absolutely. Sometimes mid-career fellows are also co-PIs on the grant. Sometimes maybe there's someone very senior at your university who doesn't fit the the parameters of the mid-career fellow. Maybe they're not going to be extensively involved, but maybe they're a co-PI on the grant. So again, this is a case where you really need to think about what work you're carrying out and what configuration makes the most sense for your grant. But absolutely, some of our grantees have co-PIs on the grant who aren't necessarily mid-career fellows, but are involved in the research. Or sometimes they're also involved in helping with institutional change. Say perhaps when I'm thinking about a case with one of our new grantees where the PI is leading the research and will be somewhat involved in the institutional change as director of a center, but decided to bring in a more senior staff member or senior faculty member to also play a critical role in guiding institutional change.
And speaking of institutional change, another listener would like to know whether the institutional change has to be in the university or could be in the partner organization. Could you talk about changes that we expect to see in both of the partners?
Sure. So again, getting back to the goals of the grant, yes, absolutely. We need to see strategies for change at the university because that is the nature of the grant. It's really shifting at least some key institutional policies and practices to better support institutional change. So we do want to see that in the proposal. We want to see that as grantees are moving along their 3 to 5 years. But we also want to see shifts at the nonprofit organization or public agency where there is increased capacity for using research evidence, whether that's training for staff, whether new positions are being created. One of our community partners used this grant in their partnership with the university to really infuse attention to research across all the elements of their organization. That's the United Way in Merrimack Valley and Back Bay in Boston. So there really are, I mean, the organization, the community partner organization is also undertaking institutional change, but in terms of the four goals of the grant, the way we break it up is to think about the institutional change is really the stuff you're doing at the university, and at the partner organization, you're building the capacity to use research evidence.
Great response. Thank you. One of our listeners really perked up when you mentioned the University of Toronto and Puerto Rico. Tell us about international context for research in the ICG program.
Sure. Well, the critical piece really is that wherever the partnership and whatever methods you propose, you are focused on improving outcomes for young people in the United States. So that has to be the focus. So in the case of Toronto and Puerto Rico, that partnership made sense because the researcher, Gustavo Babones, who himself is Puerto Rican, was working in Puerto Rico and really wanted to strengthen his interactions with the State Department of Education there. So there was a very strong rationale for why that partnership is structured the way it is across national borders. It is somewhat atypical, but again, I mean, you know, improving outcomes for Puerto Rican youth fits within our parameters of improving outcomes for young people ages 5 to 25 in the United States.
Right, Puerto Rico's United States. Thank you. Let's see. I guess I have time for about one more question. Which one of the many should it be here? Okay, great question come up. Does it change, the institutional change at the university, does it have to be university-wide? Could it be located in a school or college? Could it be just in a department? How should I think about that?
That is a great question. It does not have to be university-wide. Fantastic if it is, but that can be very challenging to do. I would say, you know, one of our grantees at the University of Virginia, that changes university-wide, but what they mean by that, it's really the work is emanating from one center to better support faculty in their efforts to engage in university research. Oftentimes, at least initially, the strategies for changing tenure and promotion policies tend to be located within schools or, you know, the College of Public Health, a public policy school, but oftentimes the work emanates outwards from those initial areas. You know, I mean, maybe the scope of university change could be within a department, but honestly, I don't know that the selection committee members would find that quite ambitious enough. You really want to try to build support across a college or division within a university to engage in efforts of institutional change. Adam, do you want to add anything to that? I want to make sure.
I just really agree with what you said, Jenny. I think a selection committee might question the ambition of a project that promised institutional change only within a department, but most of the successful grantees have been about institutional change within their school or college. So that has been a winning argument in many cases.
Thanks.
Well, it's 2 o'clock in the East Coast. We've come to the end of our time. Not all the questions were answered. We'll try to answer those in writing or through an FAQ that comes out afterwards. And I know, Jenny, you want to repeat the news about sharing the webinar?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Yeah, so we get these online pretty quickly. We will share this recording. Hopefully it'll be another good resource for you. I do want to note, I can't remember if I said this already, our portal will open May 15th. So that is when you can start going in and putting the pieces of your application together. If you have challenges with that, please do reach out to us. And we look forward to receiving your good applications. Please reach out with additional questions. And yes, we will follow up, I think, via email with a link to the recording. If not, it will be on our website soon. Application guidance is up already for this year. It's not all that different from years past, but we do have a checklist in there this year, so you remember to get all the components in. So thanks for joining us today. We look forward to seeing your application.